Well, I think we're about good to go here. Let's see. All righty, well, welcome all. Thank you for joining today for our webinar. I'm excited to share the prairies here at Powell Gardens with you over this next hour. So my name is Julie Copley, and I'm the Conservationist here at Powell Gardens. Just a couple notes before we get started. If you can make sure your microphone remains muted during the conversation, it will help with sound quality for everyone. I hope this conversation sparks many questions for you all. And if you do have questions, I ask that you include them in the chat feature of Zoom. As I anticipate, we'll have some time to answer some of those questions at the end. So with that, we'll be good to go, and we'll just jump right in here. So you see this image up on your screen, and I want to start here as kind of to get us going on some of the ideas and concepts we're going to be talking about today. So you see this image, and this is a late fall view of the prairie here at Powell, one of the prairies at Powell. And so kind of 3 points to take away. So one large aspect of our discussion is going to be the prairie itself. So you see this grassland, the sea of grass, all that concept moving forward and where the grass meets the sky. So that's going to be one large component of what we're talking about today. Second would be how the grass meets other ecosystems like forest and woodland. And finally, how the prairies interact here at Powell Gardens. Obviously, you can see kind of one of the center points of our gardens, the Majory Powell Allen Chapel. And it's a large component of our botanical garden, and it's something pretty special. So here we are. By the end of this conversation, you will see certainly beyond the sea of grass of what a prairie is. Our main themes that we're going to be focusing on today are just highlighting how interconnected prairies are. These are communities that are influenced by a variety of living and non-living factors that make this ecosystem very diverse and truly pretty special. So to get to a place where we can talk about how complex and how special these prairie ecosystems are, we're going to start by building a foundation of what a prairie is, the prairies we have here in North America, the species that are foundational to this ecosystem, disturbances, our conservation status. And once we build that foundation, then we'll jump into some of these complex relationships within this diverse ecosystem. And then finally, tie that all to the prairies at Powell. So here we are in the heart of the Great Plains here in the Kansas City region, and we are fortunate enough to have some of the most iconic grasslands in the US right outside our backyard. So when I mention these here, I'm discussing the Flint Hills region of Kansas was just a couple hours away. So this image is pretty vivid for most of those most likely that are from this region. These rolling hills and large expanses of grassland and treeless landscape. So if we want to take a step back though, these grasslands aren't just in Kansas or in the central US. Grasslands are actually found all across the world in every continent except for Antarctica. So we have these different ideas on what a grassland may be, especially with us being so close here to the Flint Hills, but grassland can really encompass a variety of different things. And that takes us to this step to looking at prairies specifically. So within this larger grassland biome, we have numerous different ecosystems. All of these ecosystems that you're going to see in this continuum chart here, so you see the prairie, the savanna, and the woodland. So each of those is going to carry some of these grassland specific species. Each of these categories are separated dependent on the amount of canopy cover. So when we think of our prairies, we often think of them as ecosystems that don't have any canopy cover, but that's actually what defines a prairie is 10% or less of canopy cover. So just because if you see a few trees within a prairie landscape, that doesn't mean it's classified as something else. Moving our way across on this continuum, you have the savanna here, which this is an ecosystem that we also have here in Missouri, and that is defined as 30% or less of canopy cover. And this most often, what we think of here in this area are some of those hardwood tree species. So oak savanna is a ecosystem that has very distinct plants, but we're still going to hold on to a lot of those grassland species. So each of these four, to take a step back before we dive into just prairies, each of these four ecosystems, prairies, savannas, woodlands, and forests, are all found in our region. I do want to mention one more here. So the glade ecosystem, which would fit right in between the prairie and savanna or so. This is typically a rocky outcropping or kind of a rocky based prairie that can have canopy cover anywhere from 0 even up into the woodland side of canopy cover, which is about 60%. But what we're just going to be focusing on today, I want to give you some context of what ecosystems we have in this region and what makes prairie distinct. But what we'll be focusing on today is just prairie, which is an ecosystem dominated by grasses and forbs and has less than 10% canopy cover. So within prairies in the United States, there's kind of a continuum of more even specific prairies. So prairies in general span farther than just we think of for the Kansas and Missouri region, but all the way east into Ohio and Indiana, and then all the way west to the Rocky Mountains. So this map really gives us an idea of how widespread prairies are, but this doesn't include all the grassland biomes. There's grasslands all over the US. So this just focuses on prairies. So the color distinction you're seeing here is subcategories of the, or ecosystems, ecotypes of the prairie ecosystem. So here we are, I'm drawing, and where's that? We'll just enjoy that little line there for now. But here we are, you see in the Kansas City region, kind of on that western edge of the tall grass prairie region. So while these borders shown on the map are a little fluid, this can kind of give you an idea of how it's broken up. So what this means is that the prairies we have here in Kansas City and to the east of us are going to be dominated by those tall grass species, reaching from 6 to 8 feet. As you work your way west, it would be no surprise that it does get drier as you approach the Rocky Mountains. This is reflected then in the plants that can grow there. So where we have tall grasses here in the tall grass prairie region, they start to get shorter in height as you work your way westward. And like I said, that's dependent on the amount of precipitation we have going on here. So to kind of rein it in where we've been and where we're going. So we've talked about grasslands as an overarching biome. Then we go to prairies, which are ecosystem here in the central US, where this map showed the different prairies that are there here in the US. Then you break it down another step, and we're in the tall grass prairie region where there's more annual precipitation than what you work your way westward. And then we're going to take one step further. Who knew prairies could get so specific? So the majority of our presentation is going to focus on specifically mesic tall grass prairies, which I'll jump into a little bit more here shortly. So as we think of that transition in that triangle of grasslands, prairies, tall grass prairies, and mesic tall grass prairies, the distinction between tall grass prairies and the mesic tall grass prairie is when we start to kind of get to the nitty-gritty ecotypes here. So a tall grass prairie is further defined by its topography, geology, and precipitation. So we have on the moisture level, we have wet prairies, mesic, which are medium or wet to dry prairies, and then we have dry prairies. So that's the moisture component here. You have the topography, which can also, depending on the slope and aspect, then affect the amount of moisture that's going on, and the geology. So we have limestone here in Missouri, and sandstone, and chert base, and all of these factors are going to affect the plant communities that can survive. So in Missouri alone, we have 12 types of prairies, ranging from dry prairies to mesic to our wet prairies, and then even more specific based off that geology. With this incredible amount of diversity, both in conditions and in plant communities that we're going to see, the remainder or the central plant community can stay the same throughout the tallgrass region. So there are some foundational families that are represented within the tallgrass prairie. And those would be, some of these may come as no surprise. So the three main plant families that you're going to find in the tallgrass prairie ecosystem are Asteraceae, the aster or daisy family, Fabaceae, legume, or most likely more known as bean family, and no surprise here in our grasslands, the grass family, Poaceae. So I want to go through some of the examples of the plants that can, from these families that are found in our prairies, but I do want to note that there are so many more than are representative here, but this will just kind of give us an idea of what those foundational species are. So I have to start with our grasses. Our prairie grasses are truly, when we think about, to equate it to another ecosystem, when you think about trees of your woodland, these are those foundational characteristic plants that hold down this ecosystem. So these grasses can reach from 6 to 8 feet in height, and even beyond that, depend on the moisture and specific tallgrass prairie type you're looking at. So here we see Indian grass with its bright and rich seed head, big blue stem, which is also called turkey foot. You can kind of see some of that characteristic in both of these images on the right-hand side, kind of that turkey foot-like seed structure that makes it a little bit easier to identify. And then finally, another representative would be eastern gamma grass, which is a bunch grass that can also get in those 6 to 8 feet ranges throughout the season. Grasses play a really important role in our prairies, and they firmly hold the soil in place, preventing erosion from occurring. As with any of these plant families, you're probably going to have one representative that comes to mind when we mention these different groups, but there really is such a diversity beyond that. I'm going to reiterate that often because there's just an incredible amount of diversity beyond those maybe first species that come to mind. And I think a good example of that would be with our aster family. So we all are probably familiar or think of prairies as being sunflowers and some of those other characteristic plants that are just take on this identity of a prairie. So there actually are 16 sunflower species here in Missouri, all native and all crucially important to our prairie habitats, reaching 6 to 8 feet, again, competing with the grasses and providing a good pollinator source. Here you can kind of see I caught just a little bit of a monarch in flight going from stem to stem here. And this is actually Maximilian sunflower, which is one of those that's going to get up into the 6 to 8 feet region. So though there are 16 sunflowers in itself in Missouri, there are still so much more to this plant family. So here are some other examples of things you're going to see in this aster or daisy family. So this compass plant here on the left, I really encourage you all to take a look and try to find this one. I would say in about July or so. You can kind of see it's right along the sidewalk here in the wildflower meadow at Powell, and it is truly beautiful. It gets, once again, into those 8 feet ranges. The foliage on it is super intricate, and you can guess that there's a little meaning behind the name there. I encourage you all to look up more on compass plant. Working your way across, you have ironweed, which has this deep, rich purple blue, different than the sunflower bloom structure you're going to think of. Sneezeweed, which unfortunately got a rough name, but is not connected to an allergy in itself. And then the beloved blazing stars. You may be familiar with this one. Another one of the species is actually in my background right now. That is prairie blazing star, whereas this one's rough blazing star. All of these plants and the many more asters that are in the prairie are great pollinator sources and truly are just another one of those key family foundations to this landscape. Another one that maybe was a little bit of surprise to some as being such a foundational family is the Fabaceae or bean family. So this family, being known for being returning nitrogen to the soil, comes in a diversity of blooms across this landscape. So here we see round-headed bush clover, Another clover, purple prairie here, clover. You can see two small insects hanging out on this one here. White wild indigo, which you may be familiar with as a cultivar in your own garden. Sensitive briar with these bright pink fluff-like blooms that are really, really unique. And then lastly, you have lead plant right here. So these are, like I said, just some of the many, many Fabaceae that can also be found on the prairie. So to review, our three main families on the prairie are going to be our grasses, our asters, and our beans. But with that, there are so many more. So many more, as in there are over 800 plant species found in prairies in Missouri. And many of the other families representative are ones you are probably familiar with in your own gardening or even as houseplants. So we have Cactaceae here. Yes, there is a native Missouri cactus that's eastern prickly pear cactus that's found in our dry prairies, well-draining prairies. An orchid. This is one of many orchids, many as in probably 5 to 7 orchids that are here in Missouri. So this is Nodding Lady's Trusses, and it is a late fall bloomer found on those mesic medium moisture prairies. And then lastly, one representative of the rose family, though there are many, we have here the pasture rose. So with all this diversity now in conditions, from geology to moisture to plant families, there's another component here that supports the amount of diversity that's on our prairies, and that are natural disturbances. So our prairies are naturally acclimated to disturbances. Throughout their natural history, they have experienced many of these reoccurring disturbances and has helped shape the community that it is. So some of those disturbances include grazing, fire, and then more modern or present day mowing and invasive species. So we're going to kind of dive into that here. So you think about grazing on a prairie, or just a prairie in general, you probably can't help but think of bison. So bison are that poster grazer of the prairie. They once spanned the entire range of the tall grass prairie, and they are truly, even today, pretty special to see when you can see them grazing in a prairie. So this here is at the Nature Conservancy's Dunn Ranch Prairie. But what are these animals doing? So bison and other ungulates or hooved animals create many different opportunities in a prairie for other plants to grow. So we've built on this idea of interconnected and complex ecosystems, but this ecosystem is also highly competitive. When you look at prairies, they are incredibly dense with all of these plant species that sometimes specific plants aren't going to get an opportunity to grow unless there's grazing or another disturbance. So as bison move their way through a prairie, they're opening up other opportunities for plants to then take off. So bison will mostly forage on the grasses, which those large foundational grasses can also take up a lot of that sunlight opportunities from some of the other forbs. So by grazing, bison are going to open up other spots for plants to grow. Another way is that they are going to naturally move seeds. So in large parts of the prairie, you can move diversity in some of these plants from one part to another by getting attached to that nice coat that they have on there. Probably the most second characteristic thing that comes to mind in a prairie are burns. So prescribed and naturally occurring burns have been occurring on the prairie landscape throughout its natural history. And the reason that this ecosystem can come back time and time again is that 75 to 80% of prairie plants species live beneath the surface. So when you see a 6 to 8 foot tall prairie plant, you know that even more of its entire composition is beneath the surface. And so what does this do for prairies? So when a burn occurs, either naturally or more present day, what we're situating a prescribed burn or an intentionally set burn, that cycles nutrients throughout the prairie. You're essentially adding fertilizer to the entire prairie. You're breaking down that plant material from the year before and applying it directly to the surface. Burns are also effective in controlling some woody species. So this is going to be more of like your eastern red cedar and some of your more brushy species, though this won't manage those hardwoods or any of those woody species that, if we think back towards the beginning when we talked about prairies, savannas, and woodlands, those three ecosystems are all fire adapted. So you have an oak starting to grow in your prairie, it is not going to be affected by the fire. Another one that's not included on this slide, but is another critical part of it, is that you'll see in this photo on the right side where everything has already been burned. When that comes to springtime, that is going to germinate, that solar radiation is going to germinate all the plants growing just that much quicker. In some areas, you can't accomplish a burn or a grazing. So this is a more modern approach and not being part of the natural history of prairies quite so much, but is important and used today. So like I said, in some areas, you're not going to be able to have a prescribed burn given proximity to homes or other structures. And likewise, you may not be able to have grazing, though both of those have been accomplished in very specific areas. But mowing is a great other disturbance that happens on a prairie. It reduces that accumulated litter, similar to a burn or of grazing. And once again, it's creating opportunities for certain plant species to establish. All right, and the last component of our disturbances that we're seeing on prairie landscapes are certain plants, invasive species most often referred to, which are plants that didn't evolve in or with the habitat, and as a result have a very competitive advantage in this community. So most often you think about how dense a prairie is, so you wonder, how do these plant species get in there? So these are happening, like the arrival of invasive species happens most commonly when you have some sort of disturbance, and that can be more as in like if you were driving across a prairie or just creating open, bare soil spaces. And then if these seeds come about, this is a great opportunity for them to come in and slowly start to affect the landscape. Invasive species are honestly a conversation in part of every conservation management area today. Unfortunately, everyone's having to manage them in different ways. And what it really comes down to is that invasive species challenge the integrity of the remaining prairies we have. So you'll see here Sericea lespedeza, which is in that Fabaceae family. So it is a bean. It has very long seed life in the soil and has kind of a woody stem to it. Is very challenging to manage because of how long that seed can last in the soil. And then you also have eastern red cedar, which you may be familiar with as you drive past almost any highway. So you can see these sometimes starting to pop up in what would seem like a grassland. And with time, if you're getting a dense stand, almost like what's shown here, that's essentially going to shade out the prairie. So each of these disturbances has an interesting relationship with the prairie and affects the species that can live there. There is another component that I think really just finishes off that foundational idea of what a prairie is, what the relationships we have today are, and some of the challenges or just really complexity to it. And that, unfortunately, is the amount of habitat we have lost. So temperate grasslands are North America's most endangered ecosystem. The tallgrass prairie once spanned over 167 million acres across the US. Today, that's less than about 4%, with most of it being in Kansas. And as you could expect, that same showing is here in Missouri. So on the left, all of that dark peach color is remnant prairie prior to settlement into Missouri. And on the right, that is what we're looking at today. So Missouri previously supported 15 million acres of prairie across the state. And today we have less than 0.5%. But we can't dwell in this because there are great opportunities for restoration and conservation. And hopefully these next species and relationships will kind of renew us all in how special these ecosystems are. So let's start thinking about the relationships going on here in the prairie now that we have the foundation of what we're talking about. So this one may look fairly familiar here. I hope it's familiar to all. If not, I'll share a little bit about here. So this is one example of a specialist plant and animal relationship that exists on the prairie and in some other ecosystems here in Missouri. So this is the monarch butterfly. So this migrating butterfly is dependent on milkweed plants. So there are many species of milkweed in Missouri, with a number of them being found on prairies. So the monarch is dependent on this plant in its larvae stage. So if you want to jump back to that picture on the left, you see that circle around, that is a monarch caterpillar. And you can kind of see the remnants of what it has consumed or a previous generation has consumed there. So this caterpillar is dependent on milkweed for the kind of the white latexy sap that spills out of the leaves as they are punctured. And what's in that sap is cardiac glycoside, which is a toxin that monarchs use. So they are not very tasty to things that would want to consume the monarch. So it's essentially an anti-predator story. So let's jump back here. So at this point, we're just connecting two things here. We're connecting plants or connecting animals. But how does that relationship change when you have the frequency of disturbance like you do on the prairie? So another story here is the regal fritillary. So this butterfly, which you can see on the left, is a Missouri and federal species of conservation concern. They are dependent on tall grass prairies and the plants that are supported on these ecosystems. So regal fritillaries are similar in the way that monarchs are dependent on a host plant as a larva. So for them, it's not milkweed, it is violets that are found on prairies. So this is one example of a violet that can be found on our prairie ecosystems. But here's where we start to dig into these complexity. So the regal fritillary, unlike the monarch, one, does not migrate, and two, overwinters on the prairie. So whereas a monarch could go from an egg to a butterfly in about 30 days, this is a much more drawn out process. So the regal fritillary will lay its eggs in late fall. Those eggs will overwinter on the prairie, and when they emerge, they will start consuming on this prairie violet. Later in the spring and early summer, that larvae will, once it's eaten enough of that prairie violet, will go into chrysalis. And as it emerges, it's going to want something for nectar source. So some examples of what they're looking for as a full butterfly would be pale purple coneflower, which emerges or is available in early June, bee balm late June, and prairie blazing star in early July. The regal fritillary is not dependent on these specific nectaring sources, but these are some preferred ones that they will utilize. So at this point, there needs to be both the violet species and something for it to nectar on. But let's think back to where the regal fritillary is over the winter. So the regal fritillary is overwintering in the prairie. This is the same time that most often some of those disturbances are happening. So how do you take a disturbance-sensitive species where that caterpillar is not going to be able to migrate or move over the winter, and how does that continue to exist in a habitat that is so dependent on disturbance in itself. So there are studies that are kind of looking at this dynamic relationship, because we have to keep in the back of our mind throughout this conversation that when you think about how few remnant tallgrass prairies there are in Missouri, it's quite few. So that's really what adds another pressure here. So we've stated that regal fritillaries overwinter in the prairie, often when prescribed burns occur. I don't want to make that general statement because prescribed burns can happen throughout the year depending your goals, but currently right now the push is for this dormant season. So you have that part of it. So when you're burning, obviously that is going to affect any insects that are overwintering in that prairie. So in a study here by Morans and all, we're looking at prairies here in Missouri and regal fritillaries response to disturbances such as burns. So you could assume this one, if you're connecting the dots here, that regal fritillaries are significantly less prevalent early in their flying season, so that June time after an area has been burned. But what we're seeing in this research and in others is that while you're not seeing regal fritillaries early in that June flight time, that later in that, so late July, early July, they're just as abundant as in an area that hasn't been burned, because those burns, when I was mentioning they're stimulating germination in the springtime, that is going to bring back just as many nectaring plants. So while it starts off that there are fewer and less where an area has been burned, it ends up counteracting because the amount of nectaring plants is that much more abundant. So if that just doesn't throw in enough complexity to it, let's think about another story here that kind of goes along with this idea of how connected our prairies are, and specifically our modern day prairies. So a similar story can be thought of when we think of our grassland birds. So the grassland and ground nesting birds are experiencing the most community-wide decline of North American birds. So here we have the dick thistle, the grasshopper sparrow, and Henslow sparrow, which are all grassland birds that can be found here in Missouri. So in this study by Swangle and Swangle in southwestern Missouri, they were looking at how vegetation and vegetation structure affects the abundance of these birds. So right off the bat, when we're not even thinking about disturbance, the research suggests that diversity, patch size, prairie quality, and prairie type were significantly affecting the abundance of each of these grassland birds. So that provided a baseline of where these birds are most common found and what they are preferring in a prairie. And then there was another component that goes in, the disturbance, which is such a big part of our prairies. And what they're seeing is that the Henslow sparrow, which is the most at-risk species, is significantly preferring a lot of litter or plant material over the course of the year, that they are found more abundantly when you have that litter. You're working our way across here. The grasshopper sparrow there was a less of a relationship shown between the amount of litter and their abundance, yet still a connection that grasshopper sparrows do want that litter, but it's less strong. And then you go over to the dick thistle, and there's no support for a strong connection between the amount of litter. And the reason that this comes together is that you think about some of those disturbances that are going on. And while some of these disturbances like fire or grazing or mowing are going to benefit some species, they're also going to challenge some of the others. It just adds another layer of just the amount of relationships that are going on within this sea of grass. So we've kind of built this idea, and hopefully I haven't overstressed about how complex and diverse this ecosystem is. But if we rein that all in, we can start thinking about some of the prairies areas we have at Powell Gardens. So I hope many of you have been able to experience the grazing that we're putting back on the landscape. So here we are, we have some goats, which are brought to us by a partnership we have with Goats on the Go, Kansas City. So while they are not bison, they are doing a lot of the same beneficial effects on our prairies. So that Taricia lespedeza that I mentioned earlier is an invasive species that a lot of our prairies have on it. It's a struggle that's across Missouri. So one of the beautiful and cool relationships here between the goats and the prairie is that the goats actually prefer to forage on this plant. So they will consume this plant, sterilize the seed so it's no longer viable as they're digesting, and return nutrients to the soil. So they are opening up other opportunities for plants to grow that may have otherwise been overcrowded. I do want to just say a quick thank you to anyone who supported the Goat Fund Me drive this year. I can gladly say that the goats will be back in the garden. So we have this disturbance as grazing, and here's an alternative to that. And we're seeing the relationships and the response to grazing throughout our natural communities at Powell. You can see there's quite a few goats here. We're pretty mindful to make sure that no area is grazed either too hard or too frequently, because that does have negative effects as well. So another one of those characteristic disturbances that are happening here at our own botanical garden are prescribed burns. So both of these images here are from burns that happened this last winter. And it is really interesting to see how these communities are responding to fire. So I'll jump onto that next, but I do want to make a mention here. So when we think about the conservation status of prairies as a whole and some of the characteristics of animals that live on there, such as the regal fritillary, this is where it becomes crucial that we don't overmanage or burn or graze or any of the above more than a third to a half of a prairie each year. So this is what we're essentially doing here. So you can see this is actually the wildflower meadow, which you can probably recognize by the chapel here in the landscape. So we just burn this lower section all the way around. And this is really important because that provides refuge for anything that is moving at the time of our prescribed burn, and it gives them a chance to head over to plenty of other prairie space that it can then carry out the rest of the winter. Same here, you may recognize the silo. This is the butterfly meadow and the harvest garden. And there are many prairie supporting areas right around this particular prairie, and we would also not burn those. So there's some mindfulness that goes into some of these disturbances now that we're in a highly fragmented landscape. So what are some of the changes that we're seeing as part of our reintroducing a lot of these disturbance regimes? So we're seeing a variety of changes in our plant communities from year to year. This one's a great example of that. So this was taken in July. This photo was taken in July of 2021. And in this area, which would be the middle section of the wildflower meadow, we had a burn in December of 2020. And prior to that, we had not seen a population of Culver's root, which we think, okay, what's special about seeing this plant? So this plant is indicative of just a better overall, more rich, healthy prairie community. So this was really great to see. And you can just see the changes that are going on based off of these disturbances and the right opportunities that plants have. So this was following, like I said, a burn here. And so we will see what comes back in some of our other areas that we burned here in 2021, 2022. And what other dynamics are going on here that I encourage you to look out for. So this is prairie dodder or a cuscuta species. And yes, it is that orange string-like material you see growing here. So this is kind of a mystery plant. There's a lot of research going on about what that dynamic looks like and how it fully functions, but essentially it does not produce chlorophyll. So it doesn't have the ability to absorb light. So it is going to, you can kind of see on that left-hand photo, it's going to wrap around and use its haustorium, which is like a small projection from it to take resources from the host plant. So what's been seen so far is that those host plants aren't being negatively affected, but there's still so many unknowns here. So is there an insect that's consuming this plant? Are there birds or other small animals that appreciate the cover from this? This is kind of an open-ended question. This just gives you an idea of how much we are recognizing about what's going on in our prairies and in the tallgrass prairie region as a whole, but also how many questions there still are. I invite you to kind of have that mindset when you're visiting some of the prairies at Powell, because there are so many interesting relationships and dynamics going on here that many are still kind of untold. So here we are thinking of Powell as a whole. So our prairies are just truly a special treasure that many botanicals gardens don't get to claim themselves as a prairie botanical garden. I really encourage you to explore the landscape that we have here and to notice closely how they're going to change from year to year. As you saw with the presence of Culver's root, and I expect more variation from year to year as we reinstate management and disturbances across the property. But to take a step back, this is truly a reflection of our Midwest spirit of place. We're located right in the heart of both the prairie and in this interesting transition zone from the tallgrass prairie to the midgrass prairie. It's a really crucial ecosystem to where we're located, and it is worth really sharing and treasuring. And it can be maybe a hard one to pitch, grasslands at point, but as you can see, and as I hope you've all experienced, there's so much more to it than what you're going to see from that outside perspective of just grass. There's so much here to unpack, and this was truly kind of just at the tip of it. So we do have many prairie communities here at Powell, about almost 100 kind of fragmented smaller acreages around the entire property. But I do encourage you to visit two particular prairie areas. So this here is the Butterfly Meadow and the Harvest Garden. And this was originally seeded with a hay bales from a remnant high quality prairie in the Sedalia area. And then you have the Wildflower Meadow, which is very distinguished by the Meadow Pavilion here. So both of these are great spots to watch the prairie communities change throughout the seasons. And I truly encourage you throughout the seasons, because here you'll see just how different these communities are going to look. So this on the left-hand side is right after a spring after a prescribed burn. So you can see that's rattlesnake master starting to pop up, gray-headed coneflower, and yarrow. And that excitement and richness of ecosystem lasts all throughout the season. So here on the right side, this is fall in the prairie, and you can see that goldenrod is just really showing off a lot of its character, along with the trees that are supporting it in the background. And I can't help but to pitch throughout this excitingness of prairie that there's going to be a unique opportunity to further explore prairies in general hosted by Powell. So this will be our first year of the Powell Gardens Native Prairie Series. And this is actually going to be hosted at Ona's Prairie, which is a prairie that was gifted to the gardens in 2019 by Ona Gishin. It is outside Sedalia, Missouri, and it is truly a treasure. These are all photos from that prairie there. It is going to be a 3-part workshop-based series, and the first session will be on May 10th. I encourage you, if you are interested, to keep an eye on the website, as information will soon be released there. And a little side note, it is limited to a small amount of participants, so I encourage you to check frequently about its arrival. Well, thank you all so much for letting me share just how special this ecosystem is. I hope you all get a chance to explore. I open this up for any additional questions here, and I just appreciate you all being members and supporting what the garden is doing. So thank you all. All right, so I do see a question here about controlling the goats' movement. So most frequently, we'll just take a step back. The goats are contained by solar powered transportable fence. And so what we'll do is they most often have about a 1/4 acre at a time, and that will take about 3 to 4 days to graze to the extent that we would like them to. And then at that point, we will create additional fence and then kind of essentially make a gate and move along. We have a great partnership with Goats on the Go, and they are, except for when they're particularly hungry, they're pretty well behaved and manage the fence pretty well. So thank you for that question. Well, I'll keep an eye here, see if anything comes through in the next few minutes. If not, if there's anything else that you can think of that you do have a question prairie-wise, I will try my best to answer it. So here is my contact info. You're more than welcome to reach out if there are any additional questions. I think I'm not seeing anything else come through here. Well, with that, thank you so much for your time. I hope we all can see the prairie more than just a sea of grass. Thank you all.